The auction yard in Alabama had seen thousands of lives sold before that day, so many that the wooden platform itself seemed soaked with old cries and forgotten names. The air was thick with dust and heat, the kind that clung to skin and made tempers short. Traders stood in loose circles, fanning themselves with hats or folded papers, speaking in bored, transactional tones. Enslaved men and women were lined up nearby, heads lowered, bodies already resigned to whatever fate the hammer would assign them. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be remembered. It was supposed to be ordinary. That was the cruelest part. When the auctioneer climbed onto the platform, his voice carried the confidence of a man who had repeated the same words too many times to count. He called out ages, teeth, muscle, obedience, value, reducing human lives to bullet points that could be priced and discarded. Bids rose and fell without drama. One man was sold quickly. A woman with a crying child was separated without pause. The crowd barely reacted. This was business. This was routine. This was Alabama in those years, where human suffering had become background noise. Then the murmuring began. It started not with shouting or spectacle, but with an uncomfortable shift in attention. Heads turned. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Even the auctioneer paused, his practiced rhythm breaking for just a moment. From the edge of the yard, a woman was being led forward. She did not stumble. She did not resist. Her chains were light compared to others, almost symbolic, and she was as if she had chosen to step onto that platform herself. That alone unsettled the crowd. Enslaved women were expected to appear broken, fearful, visibly defeated. She was none of those things. She was young, though not fragile. Her posture was straight, her movements controlled, deliberate. Dust coated her shoes, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that did not belong in that place. When she lifted her head, her eyes met the crowd, not pleading, not defiant, but observant, as if she was studying them instead. The heat seemed to intensify, and the usual laughter and crude remarks that followed female slaves onto the stage did not come. Men shifted their weight. A few cleared their throats. Something about her presence disrupted the unspoken rules of the auction. The auctionee recovered and began his pitch, but even his voice sounded different now, strained by curiosity he could not explain. He spoke of her age, her health, her excellent condition, the standard lies meant to inflate value. Yet the crowd was no longer listening to his words. They were watching her hands, steady, her face composed, her silence unnerving. She did not glance around in panic or search for mercy in strangers' faces. She stood as if the outcome, whatever it might be, was already known to her. The opening bid was announced, a number reasonable enough for a young enslaved woman. Almost immediately, a planter near the front raised his hand. Then another, then another. The speed of it startled everyone, including the auctioneer. Prices climbed in sharp jumps, skipping the cautious incre. Men's buyers usually favored. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed nervously, as if trying to convince himself this was a joke. Another man frowned, doing calculations in his head, unsure why his hand was inching upward despite his better judgment. As the bidding rose, so did the tension. This was no longer about labor or resale value. Men who had not planned to bid at all found that themselves pulled into the frenzy. Pride played a role, of course. No man wanted to lose to a rival, but there was something else at work, something harder to name. It was as if owning her meant possessing an answer to a question no one dared to ask out loud. Each new bid felt less like a financial decision and more like a test of nerve. The woman remained still as numbers soared beyond reason. She did not flinch when the price surpassed what most men earned in years. She did not react when the crowd gasped at a figure so high it bordered on absurd. Only once did her expression change, and it was so subtle few noticed. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening at the corner of her mouth. Not fear, not hope. Recognition. By now the auction yard was silent except for the auctioneer's voice and the sharp calls of bidders. Even the enslaved people waiting their turn watched her, some with awe, others with dread. They had never seen anything like this. A woman being fought over not as a body to be used but as something rare, almost dangerous. Overseers exchanged uneasy glances. Traders smiled thinly, already imagining the stories this sale would create. The price kept climbing, break. In records, no one had thought to challenge. Sweat ran down faces, hands trembled as bids were shouted, and still no one backed down. One buyer dropped out abruptly, cursing under his breath as if waking from a spell. Another hesitated, then raised his offer anyway, his jaw clenched in anger at himself. The auctioneer's voice grew hoarse, yet he pressed on, sensing history unfolding beneath his fey. When the final bid was called, it landed like a thunderclap. The amount was staggering, so high it sucked the air from the yard. For a heartbeat no one spoke. The auctioneer scanned the crowd, waiting for a counter that did not come. The gavel hovered, then slammed down with a crack that echoed across the silent space. It was done. The most expensive slave woman ever auctioned in Alabama had just been sold. A wave of sound returned, gasps, murmurs, disbelief. Men shook their heads, some in admiration, others in regret. A few laughed too loudly, trying to mask their discomfort. The buyer stepped forward, his expression unreadable, perhaps already wondering what had compelled him to spend a fortune without understanding why. Papers were signed, coins and notes changed hands. The machine, Rive ownership resumed as if this were any other transaction, yet nothing felt settled. As she was led away from the platform, the woman finally looked toward the crowd one last time, not with triumph, not with despair, but with a calm that bordered on haunting. Those who met her gaze felt an inexplicable chill, a sense that they had witnessed something they would never fully understand. As she disappeared from sight, the auction yard buzzed with questions no one could answer. Why had the bidding gone so high? What had driven rational men into reckless competition? What exactly had just been bought? That night, the story spread beyond the yard, spilling into taverns, parlors, and plantation houses. By morning, it had grown, warped by speculation and fear. Some claimed she was cursed. Others insisted she carried royal blood or secrets worth more than gold. But beneath every rumor lay the same uncomfortable truth: the price had not matched the explanation. Something about her had shattered the illusion that slavery was simple, predictable, controlled. The auction was over, but its shadow lingered. In Alabama, where human lives were traded daily without a second thought, this single sale had cracked the routine. It left behind a question that refused to fade, a question whispered in corridors and etched into memory. Who was she, really, and why had an entire crowd felt powerless to stop bidding once she stepped into the light? By the next morning, Alabama was still talking about her. The auction had ended, the yard had been cleared, and the platform stood empty. Gain, but the woman's presence refused to fade. Her name, if anyone even knew her true name, was spoken in fragments, often followed by a pause as though saying too much might invite trouble. In taverns, men leaned closer over their drinks. On porches, planters spoke in low voices. Everyone asked the same question in different ways. Why had so many buyers wanted her? And why had they wanted her so badly? At first, people reached for the simplest explanation: beauty. It was always the easiest lie. Men described her face with exaggeration, each version more polished than the last. Some swore her skin held an unusual glow, others that her eyes were the kind that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. But those who had actually been there knew this explanation fell short. Alabama had auctioned beautiful women before, women who drew attention and crude admiration. None of them had caused seasoned traders to throw logic aside. Beauty alone did not drive men to ruin themselves. Then came the second theory: skill. Perhaps she possessed rare abilities, sewing finer than any mistress, cooking like a trained chef, reading and writing in secret. These qualities had raised prices before, especially among wealthy households eager for advantage. Yet even this could not justify what had happened. Skilled slaves were valuable, but their worth had limits. This auction had blown past those limits without slowing down. Men were not calculating returns on investment. They were reacting to something visceral, something irrational. What unsettled people most was not what she did, how she behaved. Witnesses could not stop talking about her composure. She had stood on the platform without fear, without pleading, without the hollow obedience buyers expected to see. When inspected, she did not shrink away. When spoken about, she did not lower her eyes. It was as if the auction were happening around her, not to her. That calm gnawed at men who were used to seeing submission. It made them uncomfortable, and strangely, it made them want to possess her even more. Several buyers later admitted something they could barely explain. When they raised their bids, it felt less like a choice and more like a pull. They described a tightening in the chest, a heat behind the eyes, a sense that backing out would mean losing something vital. One man confessed that he had no use for. Another slave, no need, no space, yet his hand kept rising on its own. Another said he felt as if the entire crowd were watching him specifically, daring him to step away. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, almost like challenge. There was also the way she looked at them, not at one man, but at all of them, calmly, evenly, as if she were weighing their worth rather than the other way around. This felt judged. Others felt seen in ways they did not like. In a world where enslaved people were denied agency, her gaze suggested awareness, an understanding of the men bidding on her, of their weaknesses, their vanities, their hunger to control what unsettled them. Owning her began to feel like a way to silence that discomfort. As stories spread, her price grew in the telling. The numbers fell. The drama intensified, but the core mystery remained intact. Why had rational men, experienced traders and planters, acted against their own interests? Some began to suspect manipulation. Perhaps the auctioneer had staged it, planted bidders to drive up the price. But those present rejected the idea. They knew the men who had bid. They had seen their faces, confused, flushed, almost frightened. By their own behavior. Another rumor took hold, darker and more dangerous. People whispered that she carried secrets, information that could ruin powerful families. Alabama in those days was built on hidden bloodlines, unspoken relationships, and carefully buried scandals. A woman who knew too much could be a liability. Owning her then was not about labor or pleasure, but about control. If she knew something, better to have her under one's roof than in someone else's hands. This idea spread quickly because it felt plausible. The highest bidders were not reckless young men or desperate traders. They were established, respected figures, men with reputations to protect. Why would such men compete so fiercely unless they feared what might happen if someone else won? The auction in this tell became less about desire and more about containment. The price was not what she was worth, but what silence was worth. Still, there was no proof. Just a growing sense that the truth was being carefully avoided. People noticed how the buyer, after winning her, did not boast as others usually did. He did not celebrate or gloat. He left the yard quickly, papers clutched tight, as if eager to remove both himself and the woman from public view. That alone fed the rumors. Men who bought valuable slaves typically enjoyed the attention. His silence felt like confirmation of something unspeakable. Meanwhile, stories from those who had tried to examine her more closely before the auction added to the unease. An overseer claimed she responded to commands before they were fully spoken, as if anticipating intent rather than words. A trader said she corrected him quietly when he misstated her age, then fell silent again, refusing to explain how she knew. These details, small on their own, began to stack into something unsettling. She was observant, alert, far more aware than she should have been allowed to be. Women too spoke about her, though their voices were rarely recorded. Some height women who had attended the auction later admitted feeling uneasy in her presence. Not threatened exactly, but exposed. They said she carried herself like someone who understood the world beyond her position, someone who knew how fragile the hierarchy really was. In a society built on the certainty of superiority, that awareness felt dangerous. As days passed, the question shifted from why me N had wanted her to why no one had been able to walk away. It was as if the auction had revealed a crack in the system itself. Slavery depended on predictability, on the belief that enslaved people were objects, manageable and inferior. This woman disrupted that belief without saying a word. The bidding frenzy became a collective attempt to reassert control, to prove that she could be owned, priced, contained. Yet even as people tried to rationalize their actions, doubt lingered. The explanations never fully satisfied. Beauty, skill, secrecy, each accounted for part of the madness, but not all of it. Something remained unspoken, hovering at the edge of every conversation. The uncomfortable possibility that what they had sensed on that platform was not a hidden talent or a buried secret, but a presence that refused to fit into the role assigned to it. In the end, the reason every buyer wanted her may have been the same reason none of them truly understood her. She represented a contradiction. A woman sold as property who behaved like a person beyond possession. In chasing her, men were not just bidding on a slave, they were trying to capture and control the unease she stirred in them. And that, more than any rumor or explanation, was why the price had climbed so high. When the wagon carrying her rolled through the gates of the plantation, there was no ceremony, no crowd gathered to watch the most expensive slave woman in Alabama arrive. The buyer had made certain of that. He did not want eyes, questions, or rumors following her onto his land. The wheels creaked across the T road, past rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, past slave quarters crouched low against the earth, past a house that stood tall and white, confident in its authority. This was where he believed ownership would finally make sense of what he had bought. She stepped down from the wagon without assistance. The overseer reached out instinctively, then stopped himself, unsettled by the way. She moved as if she already knew where to stand. Chains were removed, replaced with expectation. Orders were given. She listened, nodded once, and said nothing. From the very first moment, it was clear she would not make things easy, not through rebellion, but through restraint. The owner watched her closely in those early days, waiting for the fear to surface. It never did. She worked when told, learned tasks quickly, and followed rules with a precision that left no opening for punishment. There was no defiance to crush, no tears to exploit. That absence frustrated him more than resistance ever could have. He had paid a fortune for her, and yet he could not find the leverage he expected to come with ownership. On the plantation, news traveled faster than footsteps. The other enslaved PEO. Plea knew who she was before she spoke a word. They had heard the whispers, the numbers, the disbelief. Some avoided her entirely, as if proximity itself were dangerous. Others watched from a distance, curious but cautious. They had learned survival through invisibility, and she was anything but invisible. Her calm marked her as different, and difference was rarely tolerated. At night, in the low murmur of the quarters, stories began to circulate. Some said she had lived among white people before, that she knew their ways too well. Others believed she was cursed, protected by something unseen. A few dared to hope she might be a sign of change, though none spoke that thought aloud for long. Hope was fragile, and the plantation had a way of breaking it quickly. The overseers felt her presence almost immediately. They were men accustomed to obedience enforced by violence, to eyes that dropped at the sound of their boots. With her, that rhythm faltered. She obeyed, but she did not flinch. When reprimanded, she accepted correction without humiliation. When watched, she worked steadily, never rushing, never lagging. It was impossible to accuse her of laziness or insolence, yet impossible to feel in control of her. That imbalance made them uneasy. Small things began to happen, the kind that could be dismissed individually but grew troubling in accumulation. Tools went missing, then reappeared where they were needed most. A ledger was misplaced and later found open to the exact page required. Work schedules shifted subtly, improving efficiency without instruction. It was as if the plantation itself were adjusting around her, responding to her presence without anyone admitting she was the cause. The owner noticed too. He prided himself on order, on knowing every corner of his operation, every figure in his books. Yet now, decisions seemed to make themselves. Problems resolved before he addressed them. Conflicts among the enslaved quieted without punishment. He told himself this was coincidence, that his investment was finally paying off in ways he could not yet quantify. Still, a part of him bristled at the thought that she might be influencing anything beyond her assigned tasks. He tried different approaches. He summoned her to the house, questioned her about her past, her skills, her knowledge. She answered plainly when she could, and when she could not, she said, "ID nothing at all, not evasively, simply honestly." Her silence was not fear, it was refusal. And refusal, when paired with obedience, was something he did not know how to punish. The house staff reacted to her differently than the field hands. Some resented her immediately, sensing favoritism even where none was spoken. Others were drawn to her quiet authority, instinctively deferring to her in haired spaces. She did not seek leadership, but it gathered around her regardless. When she spoke, it was softly, but people listened. When she advised, it was practical, never reckless. She seemed to understand the invisible lines that kept people alive on a plantation, and she never crossed them openly. At night, while others slept, she remained awake. Not pacing, not plotting in obvious ways, listening. The plantation spoke in creaks and whispers, in footsteps and sighs, in the distant conversations of men who believed no one was paying attention. She absorbed it all. Names, habits, weaknesses. She learned who drank too much, who argued with whom, who feared exposure, who depended on silence. Knowledge became her shield, her currency. Other enslaved people began to realize that proximity to her changed things. Punishments lessened when she intervened subtly, redirecting blame or offering solutions before problems escalated. Food stores were managed better. Workload shifted just enough to keep bodies from breaking too quickly. These were not miracles. They were adjustments, small mercies carved out of a brutal system. Yet even these drew attention. Not everyone welcomed influence. Some feared that association with her would bring scrutiny. Others worried that she was too visible, that her difference would provoke retaliation. They were not wrong. The overseers grew more suspicious. The owner's curiosity hardened into something sharper. He began to watch her not as property, but as a problem that needed solving. He tested her loyalty, setting traps meant to reverend disobedience. He asked questions with false premises, waited for contradictions. Each time, she navigated carefully, avoiding lies without revealing more than necessary. Her intelligence became impossible to ignore, and with that recognition came fear. Intelligence in an enslaved person was a threat, especially when paired with composure. One evening, after a long day, the owner found himself staring at the plantation from his veranda, ledger closed on his lap. He realized, with a tightening in his chest, that he no longer felt entirely in command. Nothing had been taken from him, no rule had been broken, and yet control felt thinner, more fragile than before. He had bought her to possess something rare. Instead, he had introduced uncertainty into a world that depended on certainty. Among the enslaved, her legend grew quietly. She was not a hero in the stories told later, not yet. She was something more dangerous, a reminder that power did not always announce itself with violence, that survival could look like stillness, that resistance could be silent, patient, and terrifying to those who relied on dominance to feel secure. The plantation continued to function. Crops were planted and harvested. Whips cracked elsewhere, reminding everyone of the system's cruelty, and through it all, she remained where she was placed, neither rising nor falling, altering the landscape simply by existing within it. Those who watched closely began to understand that the most expensive slave woman had not been bought for what she could do with her hands. She had been bought because she hanged what people believed they controlled, and the longer she stayed, the more dangerous that truth became. The truth did not announce itself with thunder or confession. It surfaced quietly, the way the most dangerous things often do, through accident, carelessness, and the false belief that nothing hidden could ever truly be found. On the plantation, secrets were layered like sediment pressed down by time and fear. People assumed those layers were permanent. They were wrong. It began with a document that should never have existed in the first place. Late one afternoon, as the house staff sorted through old storage rooms beneath the main house, a locked chest was dragged into the light. It had been forgotten for years, its contents deemed irrelevant, its key long misplaced. The owner barely remembered it. When the lock was finally broken, the papers inside seemed harmless at first. Receipts, letters, contracts yellowed with age. But one folded page, thinner than the rest, carried a name that did not belong. It was not the name recorded on the auction bill. It was not a slave name at all. The handwriting was elegant, educated. The ink had faded, but the words remained sharp. T referenced a girl, her birth carefully noted, her lineage obscured, but unmistakably intentional. The language was not that of property, but of guardianship, protection, instruction. And at the bottom, a signature tied to a family whose influence stretched far beyond that plantation, far beyond Alabama itself. The owner read the page twice, then a third time, his pulse quickening with each pass. He felt the room shrink around him. The paper trembled in his hand as realization crept in, not fully formed but sharp enough to wound. This was not coincidence. This was not clerical error. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase a life and replace it with another. He did not confront her immediately. Fear made him cautious. Instead, he began searching, quietly at first, then obsessively. Old correspondence, estate records, letters exchanged between men who were now dead, men whose reputations were spotless because their secrets had been buried with them. Patterns emerged, gaps where there should have been clarity, payments made for education, for placement, for discretion. Each discovery tightened the noose around a truth he was no longer sure he wanted to uncover. She had not been born into bondage, as the auction papers claimed. She had been hidden for years. There were references to tutors, to foreign languages, to instruction meant for someone who would one day move freely in the world. And then abruptly those references stopped. In their place appeared the language of risk, of scandal, of containment. Something had happened, something serious enough that powerful men had agreed the only solution was disappearance. The safest way to erase a woman in that world was to make her a slave. The owner's first instinct was denial. He told himself he was misreading things, connecting dots that were never meant to align. But denial collapsed the moment he looked at her again with new eyes. Her composure, her intelligence, her restraint. None of it was accidental. It was learned, trained, conditioned for survival in a role she had not chosen but understood all too well. When he finally questioned her, he did so cautiously, circling the truth rather than naming it. He asked about her childhood. She gave him the version that matched the auction records, brief, unremarkable, incomplete. When he asked about her education, she met his gaze and said nothing. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and deliberate. That silence was confirmation. He realized then why the bidding had spiraled so wildly, why men with nothing to gain had competed so fiercely. Some of them must have known. Others must have sensed it. The truth had hovered around her like a shadow, invisible but undeniable. Owning her had been less about desire and more about containment. Whoever held her controlled what she knew and what she might reveal. The implications were staggering. If her real identity became public, it would unravel more than one life. Families would be destroyed, inheritances questioned, laws challenged. Slavery itself, already under strain in whispered debates, would be forced to confront an impossible contradiction. A woman reduced to property, not because she was inferior, but because she was too dangerous to exist freely. The owner understood now that he had not purchased a slave. He had purchased a lie, and lies require constant maintenance. Word began to spread despite his efforts. Secrets have a way of leaking, especially when fear sharpens curiosity. An overseer noticed discrepancies in her paperwork. A house servant overheard a conversation never meant to be shared. Pieces moved quietly from mouth to mouth, always incomplete, always distorted, but always circling the same idea: she was not who they said she was. That knowledge made her dangerous. Men who once saw her as an asset began to see her as a liability. Control was no longer enough. Silence was required. Permanent silence. The owner felt pressure from unexpected directions, letters from acquaintances advising caution, visits framed as social calls, but heavy with warning. He was reminded gently and not so gently of the consequences of disruption. She felt the shift immediately. Power always announces itself through atmosphere before action. The plantation grew tense. Overseers watched her more closely. Movements were restricted. Conversations ended when she entered a room. She did not panic. Panic would have confirmed weakness. Instead, she became even more careful, measuring every word, every glance, every step. She knew what was at stake. At night, he weighed her options. Escape was nearly impossible. Exposure was suicide, not just for her but for others tied to her past. Compliance offered no safety either. Too many people now feared what she represented. In a system built on erasure, existence itself was rebellion. The owner faced his own reckoning. He had paid dearly for her, believing possession would bring certainty. Instead, he stood on the edge of ruin. Protecting her meant defying powerful men. Eliminating her meant acknowledging the truth he had uncovered. Either path threatened to destroy him. History would later argue about what happened next, because no single version survived intact. What is certain is that the plantation records abruptly changed. Her name appeared less frequently. Work assignments shifted. Then stop. Ed. One morning, her place in the quarters was empty. No announcement was made, no sale recorded, no punishment documented. She did not appear on any ledger again. Some claimed she was sent north under cover of night, her freedom purchased quietly by someone with enough influence to erase the trail. Others believed she was moved deeper south, renamed once more, buried under yet another identity. A darker rumor suggested she was killed, her death disguised as illness or escape, her body unmarked to ensure the secret died with her. But there were those who noticed details that did not fit a simple ending. The owner sold the plantation within a year. He left Alabama entirely, his fortune diminished, his reputation intact but hollow. Several men connected to the original documents died suddenly. Their papers destroyed by fire or accident. Conversations that once buzzed with speculation fell silent, as if everyone had agreed without speaking that forgetting was safer. What remained was absence. Not the absence of a slave, but the absence of certainty, a gap in records. A story that refused to resolve cleanly. For historians, that gap became a wound in the narrative of slavery. It's proof that the system did not only enslave the powerless, it also enslaved the inconvenient, the dangerous, the women whose existence threatened the order men pretended was natural. Her secret was impossible because it should never have been allowed to exist. A woman educated, aware, and deliberately erased, sold at auction not because she was unknown, but because she was known too well. And, even after she vanished, that truth lingered, unsettling and unresolved, reminding anyone who dared look closely that some prices were paid not for ownership, but for silence. When she disappeared, it did not happen with chaos or violence. There was no chase, no public punishment, no spectacle meant to warn the others. One morning, her place on the plantation was simply empty. The space where she leapt held no warmth. Her name was not called at roll. No one asked questions aloud because questions had a way of turning into accusations, and accusations were dangerous. Silence once again did its work. At first, people assumed it was temporary. Slaves were moved often, sold, transferred, sent away without notice. But days passed, then weeks, and her absence hardened into something permanent. No record appeared in the ledgers, no receipt marked her sale, no punishment justified her removal. It was as if she had slipped out of history itself, leaving behind only the faint outline of her impact. The owner avoided speaking her name. He avoided speaking altogether when possible. Those who knew him noticed the change. He aged quickly, his confidence thinning, his temper sharpening without direction. The man who had once believed ownership could solve any problem now moved as if surrounded by traps. He reread letters late into the night, burned papers in the hearth at odd hours, and dismissed servants who lingered too long near his study. Whatever decision he had made, it haunted him. Among the enslaved, her disappearance landed differently. Some felt relief. Association with her had always carried risk, and survival often meant blending back into the background. Others felt a quiet grief, though they struggled to name it. She had not promised freedom. She had not led a revolt. Yet her presence had changed the air, had suggested that another way of existing, even within chains, was possible. Losing that suggestion felt like losing light. Stories began to form because absent. Demands explanation. One version said she escaped, aided by people who never spoke of it again. In this telling, she traveled by night, guided through swamps and back roads, her education finally used not to survive bondage, but to outrun it. Some swore they heard of a woman fitting her description, living quietly in a northern city, teaching, translating, existing under a name no one recognized. This version was spoken softly with hope, because hope needed somewhere to land. Another version was colder. It claimed she had been removed for safety, not hers, but theirs. That once the truth became too dangerous, men with influence intervened. That she was taken away quietly, her identity stripped yet again, her past sealed behind another wall of paperwork and lies. In this version, she lived, but only as a shadow, forever constrained by the secret she carried. Then there was the version no one liked to say aloud, that she was killed, not in anger, not publicly, but efficiently. That the problem she represented was solved the way problems often were in that world, by erasing the source, no grave marked, no record kept, just a quiet understanding that some truths were not meant to serve. What troubled people most was that none of these stories could be proven wrong. As time passed, something else happened, something subtler but just as telling. The plantation began to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small failures that accumulated. Productivity slipped, overseers argued more often, accounts stopped balancing cleanly. The careful adjustments she had made, the invisible stabilizing force she had been, were gone. Without her, the system reverted to brutality without efficiency, control without intelligence. The owner blamed everyone but himself. Within a year, he sold the land. The sale was hurried, the price lower than expected. He left Alabama soon after, heading east, then north, his trail thinning as he went. Letters sent to him went unanswered. People who once sought his favor stopped mentioning his name. He had not been ruined publicly, but he had been emptied. Whatever he had bought at that auction had cost him far more than money. Elsewhere, other men connected. To the story met quiet ends. One died suddenly, his personal papers destroyed in a fire that spread too quickly to explain. Another withdrew from public life entirely, retreating into illness and silence. A third moved his family west, abandoning old ties as if geography itself could erase memory. None of this was announced as connected. It never needed to be. History, as it was written at the T.I. Me barely noticed her absence. Slaves vanished from records every day, names were lost, lives dissolved into numbers and margins. Yet this disappearance lingered differently. It left behind inconsistencies historians would later trip over, gaps where paperwork should have been airtight, references that led nowhere, accounts that contradicted one another just enough to suggest intentional erasure. Decades later, scholars would argue about her in footnotes and speculative essays. Some dismissed the story as exaggerated, a myth born from discomfort. Others leaned into the mystery, pointing out that systems built on absolute control are always most threatened by those who expose their fragility. A woman like her, educated, aware, deliberately unmade, did exactly that simply by existing. What To her story endure was not just the mystery of what happened to her, but what her disappearance revealed. Slavery was often portrayed as total, unquestionable, invincible. Yet here was evidence of panic, of improvisation, of fear among those who claimed dominance. The highest price ever paid for a slave woman had not bought certainty, it had exposed vulnerability. In the end, whether she lived or died mattered less than what she proved. That ownership has limits. That identity can survive erasure. That power, when confronted with something it cannot fully understand or control, will choose silence over truth every time. She was meant to be forgotten. That was the final act of control. And yet she wasn't. Her story resurfaced because people sensed the contradiction at its core. A woman, reduced to property not because she was weak, but because she was too dangerous to remain free. A fortune paid not for labor, not for beauty, but for containment. And even that containment failed. The most expensive slave woman in Alabama was never truly owned. Not by the man who bought her, not by the system that erased her. Her body may have been controlled, her name rewritten, her path obscured, but her existence disrupted the narrative slavery depended on. That is why her secret still feels impossible. Because it reminds us that even in the most brutal systems, there are truths so volatile that they must be buried, denied, and hunted across generations. And that sometimes the greatest act of resistance is not escape or rebellion or revenge, but survival long enough to force the powerful to reveal their fear. Long after the auction yard rotted away and the plantation fields were reclaimed by weeds, the question remained, unanswered and unsettling. What terrified them enough to pay that price, and what frightened them enough to make her disappear?